Hello everybody. Well, today we're going to start our lecture notes on how to develop the structure of an academic paragraph. We'll begin by looking at introductions. Now I want to let you know ahead of time that in terms of our topic, I'll be talking about our first essay as an example. So I'll be using the example of the media essay to help us today. Now for me, if I were doing this essay, I'd probably do it on the death of the Prince. Why? Because I loved him. I thought he was a genius, and I'm a musician, and he was a man who I really admired for his talent, for his stage performances, all of those things. So I want to make the essay passionate. I want it to be about something in which I'm invested and I'm interested, and that's mine. So that's what we'll go with today for this lecture. Looking at introductory paragraphs, it's easy to break down the structure of them into various elements, and we use an acronym to describe those elements. That acronym is HST, and it stands for hook, stakes, and thesis. Now an introductory paragraph is usually going to be about 6 to 8 sentences in length, and it will follow the order of hook first, stakes, and then ending with a 1-sentence thesis. 6 to 8 sentences is pretty brief, so you only have a few things to do here. I want to break down what the hook can be, what the stakes can be, as well as the thesis here in the lecture today. So, we'll start by saying that the hook is simply an attention getter. If you're watching a CSI program, you know that the first 40 seconds of it will be a clip that's designed to keep you watching, right? It's something maybe a little bit gory, some blood, some eyeballs popping out of somebody's skull or something. The same thing is true in writing. We want to get the reader's attention immediately and then keep it throughout the essay. So, we do this in about 1 sentence and normally no more than 2. Again, it's just brief and to get the reader's attention. Here are some things that you might do in order to do that. So, a hook can be a simple question, right? It can be a quote or an epigraph, and I'll come back to that in a minute. It can be a hard-hitting fact or statistic. It can be a brief story or anecdote. And I say brief, if you're going to give a story, you only have 6 sentences in the paragraph, or 8, so this better not be more than 2. You don't want to talk about yourself and throw the reader off topic. And then lastly, it can just simply be a witty philosophical sentence, right? So now, again, this is the first sentence of our essay. So we have to make the reader want to read this. I don't care what device you use or combination thereof, but do it quick and get out of it and move on to the context of the essay, which is the stakes. Now going over these briefly, let's say I want to ask the reader a question. Fine. Remember, this is the only place in that argument that you can use the word you by asking a question. Something simple probably wouldn't cut it. If I just said, have you ever heard of the artist Prince? Well, kind of dry, kind of boring, right? But you might ask, have you ever seen an artist who defines a generation and whose passing leaves people in mourning as much as did with Prince Rogers Nelson? That's a good way to establish pathos and to get the reader's attention. Once you do that, you move on to the stakes. But again, there are multiple ways to do it. Sometimes you can get a quote or an epigraph. Now a quote might be something, just starting the paragraph with a quote by somebody who knew him and performed with him. Maybe Sheila E., or, well, any number of very talented artists who work with him, and they've been honoring him on social media. Maybe you take a quote from there and use it as your first sentence. An epigraph is also a type of quote, but literally an epigraph goes above your title. That's what that means. Epi means above and graph means the writing, so oftentimes an epigraph will be placed above the title, and then you'll begin to analyze the quote as part of your hook. So the actual text of the quote goes above the title, and then your analysis of it begins the essay as a hook. So either way is fine. Right? Thirdly, you can give a hard-hitting fact or statistic. For me, I might say that on the Billboard Top 100 charts right now, Prince's albums are numbers 2 through 6, only behind Beyonce's Lemonade. Right? In the last week, I might mention the number of millions of albums that he's sold, or millions of downloads that people have done. That might be a way to get people's interest. We all know about it. I might tell a brief story. Maybe I went to a Prince concert. Maybe I met him one day walking through Minneapolis. Maybe I had a great experience one night listening to When Doves Cry. You know, you can personalize it or not. You can make it about yourself or somebody else. But again, an anecdote is just a brief story, maybe your relationship to music, of funk and R&B in the 70s and 80s that inspired him, even back to James Brown. Then finally, you can get a witty or philosophical sentence. And again, it might be something about the passing of a great artist, or changing of generations, or his influence on the world, etc. So any of these things would be a good hook. You must condense them into a sentence, and no more than two, because the only job, once again, is to get the reader's attention. It's not as important as putting the stakes forth, and certainly not as important as your thesis. Once that's done, okay, again, these elements come in order. We'll call the hook checked off, and we're going to move on to the stakes. So I have written over here what the stakes is, and I'll try more to explain how you can achieve it. Simply put, the stakes is the context of your essay. We don't assume that the reader knows anything about the topic. Although most people are aware that Prince died, you can't assume that. So your first paragraph must make the reader aware of that. Secondly, you have to put forth any definitions and answer some basic journalistic questions in the context of the stakes. So, journalists use what are called the 5 W's and an H, and that's what, when, where, why, okay, etc. And then you have the 1H, which is the how. So when you're developing the stakes of an essay, you want to answer these basic questions for the reader so the reader knows the context of the assignment. I'm going to be doing an essay in which I argue which media outlet covered Prince's death the best. So obviously, I'm going to have to explain to the reader that Prince was a famous musician who was a pop musician, but whose music included elements from different genres. I'm going to say that he died at 57 years old on April 21st, 2016. I might say that he inspired generations of performers after him. I might even list the number of albums he sold. I might talk about him in the context of American music, etc. Okay. So I'm going to answer those basic questions so the reader knows who he is. And the larger question is the reader aware of what the assignment is? So, my assignment is to discuss and argue which media outlet did the best job of covering his death. So here, you're going to list those sources which will be included in your discussion. For instance, maybe I looked at CNN, maybe I looked at Fox News, maybe I looked at MSNBC, maybe I looked at Rolling Stone, maybe I looked at Reddit. Whatever sources you're working with, you should list them as part of the stakes. So, as I write my stakes, I'm going to begin by saying that Prince was an American music performer who died at the age of 57 on April 21st, 2016. He was extremely talented and inspired generations of performers who are now living and performing. His death was covered in many media outlets. Outlets such as CNN, Fox News, MSNBC, Rolling Stone, etc. have looked into his death. Right? This is all a part of the stakes. And I'm leading up to my thesis where I will say, after reading all of these articles or after watching them online, it is clear that, for instance, CNN did the best job because they didn't get into any personal speculation about his death. They only celebrated his life and influence. So we're building toward that direction by connecting our stakes to our thesis. Now there's also one other element here under the stakes that I haven't talked about yet. And depending on the topic, it's more important in some than in others. But regardless, when you're writing a stakes, you have to define any important terms. Now, here, many of those definitions might be self-evident, and I might not have to take too much time. But if I have to explain, for instance, what funk music is, or what R&B music is, take a sentence or two to do it here. If you feel like you need to discuss the Minneapolis sound of the late 70s and 80s, you can do that here. Whatever you think is necessary for the reader to understand the topic must be put forth in very clear terms. And I want any definitions that you create to be your own. Don't write, according to Webster's Dictionary, Prince was a musician, right? Make this essay as personal as possible, and that means synthesizing in your heads what you have read and put it into your own words. All right, so to review, your hook's only one sentence. The stake's going to be the bulk of the introduction. Probably 4, 5, 6 sentences if you answer all of the W's and the H and name the sources that you're going to use. Definitions might even make it longer in some cases. If your definitions get really long, well, you can save the first overall body paragraph to give more extended definitions if you want, but we want to keep it within 6 to 8 sentences in the overall introduction. So try to keep your stakes to 4 to 6 sentences. All right, finally, now moving over to the thesis statement. I'm kind of working in a confined space right now, but your thesis statement is your argumentative position, and it's just one sentence. That's it. I want your thesis statement to be the last statement, last sentence in your introduction at all times. It's just the best place to have it. In argument, your thesis will be an argumentative statement, right? One of the things that you'll have to work with in 103 is getting out of 101 mode. In 101, you're always summarizing, always explaining, but in argument, you're always defending your point. A thesis here is going to be subjective. It's not necessarily a summary or an explanation. It's an opinion. So, here, for our essay, as I mentioned before, I read all of these different sources and I've decided that CNN did the best job of covering Prince's death. And that's going to be my thesis statement. I'm just going to write it out. Right after my stakes, I'll lead into it, right, by saying that CNN, Fox News, MSNBC, Rolling Stone, etc. covered his death. And then after examining these sources, it is clear that CNN did the best job of covering his death. That's it. Okay? Make it that simple. Your thesis then becomes the point which will guide the body of your essay. Everything in the body will be dedicated to proving this point to be true. In this case, I've got to prove that CNN was the best source in covering his death. But again, it's subjective. It's what I think and what I feel. All right. So as we wrap up our introductions here, remember these basic things. 6 to 8 sentences, HST format, hook is first, thesis is last, stakes can vary in length depending on what you need. Put those elements together and you'll have a good introduction.